When I was living overseas, there was one question I just hated being asked, and it came up all the time. Where are you from? Every time someone would ask me that, it felt like being handed a pop quiz on my own identity, with no right answer. I mean, do I pick the country I was born in? The one I've lived in the longest? The one I left on purpose? I mean, I could give you a place, a city, a passport, but none of that would tell you who I am. Because whatever I say is going to trigger a whole set of assumptions about what I believe, how I think, and who I must be. So the moment I answer, I stop being a person and start being a story someone thinks they've already read. But here's the thing, I've moved around so much that I've collected countries like layers of skin, each one shaping me, but none of them really quite defining me. So maybe it's time we rethink how we go about connecting with strangers. Maybe it starts with a better question. But what do you ask someone you've just met? Something that actually opens up the conversation and gives you a real sense of who they are, without diving straight for the emotional juggler and scaring them away. I find that most people are more comfortable keeping things light at first, hence that dreaded question, where are you from? So why not turn that question on its head and ask something like, what attracted you to Barcelona? Or what do you like about living here? That alone could open up a whole orchard of low-hanging fruit just ripe for the picking, and give you a much clearer sense of what makes someone tick, and whether or not there's any common ground to explore. On the other hand, sometimes you're asked to share something about yourself in a group setting, like at a seminar or workshop when everyone has to introduce themselves. And this is where the intro question could get a little more creative right off the bat. The go-to, of course, is still, where are you from? But wouldn't it be more interesting to hear how people answer questions like, what song would be the theme to your life right now? Or what's something small that made you smile this week? What do you find beautiful that most people overlook? Or even, what do you wish people would ask you instead of where are you from? I know I'd be a lot more interested in hearing the answers to those. What about you? What would you want to know about someone you've just met? Of course, it's one thing for us to ask better questions, but the fact is, more often than not, we're still going to be asked, where are you from? And that's a question that fills me with anxiety, because I just don't have a simple answer. I mean, I've always been a wanderer. While I was still living in the States, it wasn't really a problem. I just told people I was from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the place where I was born and raised. Or if I happened to be traveling, I just named the city I was living in at the time. But when I moved to Mexico, things got more complicated. I didn't identify with Milwaukee anymore because it had been nearly 20 years since I'd lived there, so I told people I was from Denver, Colorado, because that was the last U.S. city I'd lived in. Plus, people were more likely to have heard of Denver than Milwaukee. Later, when I moved to Europe, I couldn't really fall back on the last place I'd lived. I mean, it would have felt ridiculous to say I was from Mexico. And by then, Denver felt irrelevant, and none of the other cities I've lived in between Milwaukee and Denver rang true either. And Milwaukee itself, that was so far in the past it even felt more irrelevant than Denver. I used to think the reason we stop identifying with our hometowns is because we change, but it just occurred to me that town changes too. In fact, in the 40 years since I left Wisconsin, it's practically done a 180 culturally and politically. And honestly, I'm not sure I'd fit in there anymore. I guess that's what they mean when they say you can never go home again. So my solution has been to just say I'm from wherever I'm living at the time. But even that meets with disapproval. Some people clearly want to pigeonhole you so they can build up an image based on cultural stereotypes, and others see you as a kind of cultural imposter if your home doesn't match with your accent or your passport. But honestly, this idea of home has always been tricky for me, even before I left the U.S. And it goes deeper than just how much I've moved around. I remember one time when I was going through a rough patch and I thought to myself, I just want to go home. But I had no idea where home was. Because in the end, home is really about the people in your life, isn't it? And all in all, I've led a pretty disconnected life. I mean, even when I was living in the UK with a UK passport and a British husband, I still didn't feel like I belonged. I felt like I was living in a cultural no man's land. I couldn't relate to the history or the pop culture of either my original or adopted country. And that's not the only reason I've always hesitated to identify as American when I'm abroad. It's not just because of how I feel about it, but because of how people respond to it and all the assumptions they make. Culturally, politically, for better or worse, I've just never fit into any of those boxes. Here are some of the cultural stereotypes I've run into over the years. First, there's the old trope about Americans and fast food. Not entirely undeserved. But one time in Barcelona, I made plans to go out with this Mexican girl I'd met at the hostel, and she looked at me in all sincerity and said, "But I don't really want to go to McDonald's, okay?" And I'm like, yeah, neither do I. Why would I come all this way just to eat in a fast food restaurant from back home? Let's go get some paella. And then there's the one about Americans being geographically illiterate, probably reinforced by all those YouTube videos where people on the street are asked simple geography questions and they cherry pick the most embarrassing answers. And I take special umbrage at that one because I majored in geography for my first 2 years of college. But stereotypes are often in the eye of the beholder, and I've noticed different patterns depending on the region. Here's the most common reaction I get in Europe when I said I was from the States, and I swear this is a direct quote. "Wow, an American who speaks foreign languages and isn't fat?" And yeah, that one got my back up. Even though it's true that most Americans don't speak a second language and we are facing an obesity epidemic, it's kind of like having a dysfunctional family. You can complain about them all you want, but if someone else does, suddenly you want to rush to their defense, right? The one I heard most often from Asians, especially from Chinese travelers, was, "Wow, an American who isn't loud." That one didn't really bother me. Growing up an introvert in a culture that rewards extroversion was one of the reasons I left the States in the first place. I've always felt more at home in cultures, like a lot of Asian cultures, that tend to value quieter energy. Or maybe that's just another cultural stereotype. Anyway, the loud American thing, yeah, that one holds up. I remember walking with a friend down a quiet cobblestone street just outside Prague's Old Town. Moonlight, silence, the works, when the peace was completely shattered by two very loud, probably very drunk American college students walking half a block ahead of us. It was like they were putting on a show of how much fun they were having, just in case the world wasn't watching. That brings me to another stereotype, that Americans are always calling attention to themselves. One workaway host once told me she saw a distinct difference in how Americans presented themselves when they were applying for volunteer gigs. She said they treated it like a job application, listing all their qualifications and even including references. I mean, the implication being, of course, that we're so business focused that we don't know where the professional ends and the personal begins. And I get it. I just don't want people to think that's me. And another host said that Americans tend to impose their will on the group. When the volunteers had a day off, the American volunteers suggested going to the beach and the rest of them all went along with it, and nobody voiced another opinion even though they all apparently wanted to do something else. And I thought, how is that imposing her will if she didn't even know the others disagreed? If no one says what they want, how is anybody supposed to know? To me, that felt less like arrogance and more like a mismatch in communication styles, and maybe a bit of projection. And finally, if you're living in a developing country, you're likely to be seen as much wealthier than the locals, probably because, well, you usually are. How that plays out depends a lot on the local culture. In Mexico, for example, I was constantly being asked for loans, usually by people I barely knew. But in other places like Thailand and Turkey, it was just the opposite. The hospitality was overwhelming. People were constantly offering me food and gifts and even transportation just to make me feel welcome. But if cultural assumptions can be tricky, political ones are even murkier. And for me, that's where things get especially complicated. Even back in the US, I don't tick all the boxes on either side of the fence, and I often find myself at odds with both camps if I have to jump into the fray for any reason. But when you're abroad, things can get even more charged, especially if you're talking to someone who's deeply tuned into American politics or international affairs. Their assumptions about who you are often colored by their own biases, whatever they may be. And even though I'm usually pretty good at steering away from political conversations when I don't want to get into them, I still get slapped with the label, one I didn't ask for and one I didn't earn. Depending on where someone stands, they may condemn me without a trial or fawn all over me and assume I share their views. The truth is that I probably agree with some of their opinions and disagree with others, but I'm rarely granted that kind of nuance at home or abroad. Another common assumption, even among apolitical people, is that I must feel entitled to everything the country has to offer, without offering anything of value in return. That perception is mostly rooted in our history of intervention and exploitation, and I talked more about that in my last video. Feel free to click on the end card if you want to dive into that rabbit hole. And hand in hand with this idea of entitlement is what I'll call American exceptionalism. Maybe I'm stretching the textbook definition a bit, but what I mean is this: the belief that we as U.S. citizens somehow have more rights in their country than they would have in ours. And honestly, now may not be the best moment in history to try and refute that, especially when we're talking with people from developing nations, because in some ways, they're right. Where they're not right is in assuming that I'm fine with it. But regardless, the status quo is changing, and rapidly. It never was entirely true, at least not in the way it's been expressed to me by some Europeans who actually believe that we had the freedom to live anywhere we want. I mean, that's just not the case. We have to follow the same immigration procedures as anyone else, no special treatment. But you can see where that perception leads to a lot of resentment. And that's really the heart of this whole diatribe. My objection to the question, where are you from, is that I know the answer will shape how people treat me in ways that have nothing to do with who I actually am. I mean, I'm a human being, not a country. And whether someone loves the U.S. or hates it, I don't want to be fawned over or dismissed just because of an accident of birth. And maybe the real takeaway from all this is that I could stand to temper my own assumptions too. Because yes, cultural norms do exist and they do shape how people move through the world, but at the end of the day, every person is more than the sum of their country's habits, histories, or headlines. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who fits perfectly into all the norms of their culture. So maybe the best thing we can do for ourselves and each other is to stay curious and leave room for nuance. That's the kind of world I want to live in and the kind of conversations I want to have. So next time you meet someone new, maybe think about skipping that usual script and try reaching for some of that low-hanging fruit. You never know what you'll learn about them or yourself. See you next time.